Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and like here to share with you the ideas and the thoughts about sulfonylureas in Ramadan. Are they all the same? And clearly in Ramadan, when we first started the first guidelines with the ADA in 2005, we had concerns about hypoglycemia, and we were specifically mentioning that we need to be careful with hypoglycemia, specifically the older generation of sulfonylurea. And what we saw in some of the more recent studies, such as the Darmina trial, which we published in 2019, is that when you look into the dark blue, out of Ramadan, the hypoglycemia episodes, whether the person is on sulfonylurea or not, are identical, 2.1 and 2.6%. But once there is fasting, the incidence doubles up in those without sulfonylurea, which is an interesting point because we will reflect on this. This is here confirmed hypoglycemia, and it was 4.3% in people who are not on sulfonylurea or insulin. And on sulfonylurea, it went up to 9.2. So two messages in this particular paper, and indeed in many other studies. Hypoglycemia occur whether the person is on sulfonylurea or not, but the incidence is higher when the person is fasting, and the incidence is higher when the person is fasting and on top of it sulfonylurea. Certainly, once they are on insulin, it's even higher and higher. Now, when we wrote the guidelines over the last number of years, we looked into many studies, and here is the data on observational studies in 2011, in 2013, in another one in 2011 and in 2012. And in all of these studies, when we looked into the sub-analysis, they were not designed to show the differences between one sulfonylurea or the other, but when the sub-analysis was done to see which sulfonylurea was at a higher rate of hypoglycemia, glibenclamide was clearly the highest, and gliclazide as a molecule in many of the studies was the lowest. When you look into randomized controlled trial, and here are three studies, one done by Arvent in 2012, one done by Saudi in 2011, and the last one by myself in 2014, and they were all randomized controlled trial versus a DP4 inhibitor, either sitagliptin in the first two or vildagliptin in the following one. In the previous two, it was sulfonylurea in general. And the sub-analysis showed that sitagliptin versus gliclazide was, with no statistical significance, numerically was lower in the gliclazide group, surprisingly. In the study that I was the PI for it, vildagliptin versus gliclazide molecule, there was no statistical difference between the two, which was in correlation to others. But here, these were studies done in smaller number of centers, and they were randomized controlled trial, but not within sulfonylurea as subgroups. Now, we did the gliclazide MR trial, the diamicron trial, 1,200 persons across many countries, and this was an observational real-world trial. And it showed us that out of Ramadan, the rates of confirmed hypoglycemia was very low, and during Ramadan was also low at 1.6%. There was no severe hypoglycemic episodes, which was quite reassuring trial. And here now, this is the gliclazide MR molecule. But again, this was a single molecule in one study. So consequently, in the guidelines of 2017 and indeed on the 2021, the message was more modern sulfonylurea are preferred in comparison with glibenclamide, and the dose adjustments and the timing of the dose were according to whether the person is on once daily or twice daily. The recommendation was to try to use the more modern sulfonylureas, and if the person is well controlled, to consider dose reduction. It's important to remember that in the gliclazide MR, the Ramadan trial, clinicians did not reduce the dose, perhaps as the control was not tight, and that was maybe one of the rationale. I would like now to review with you the sub-analysis of the sulfonylurea data from the DAR Global Survey, which was conducted over 2 years, 2020 and 2022, over 14 countries from as west as Morocco to as east as Indonesia. And after excluding those on insulin, as well as those with cardiac, renal, or foot complications, we ended up with 520 to 5,294 persons who were either on second generation sulfonylurea, gliclazide MR, or glimepiride, or the comparator, which was any other oral hypoglycemic drug, excluding sulfonylurea, and also excluding, obviously, the complications that we mentioned. So consequently, if you were to exclude insulin, cardiac problem, renal problem, and foot problem, the likelihood of this person to be on low risk is indeed high. So we call them in our study LRG, or low risk group. So if you were to look into the distribution of the data, the 5,294 persons, nearly half of them are on the low risk group. Gliclazide MR was the highest prescribable sulfonylurea drug of 1,200, glimepiride 830, and gliclazide as for nearly 500. The age, yellow, the color code across the presentation will remain the same. Yellow is the low risk group, gray is the glimepiride, orange is the gliclazide MR, and blue is the gliclazide molecule. And if you look into the mean age, you will find the people on the low risk group without sulfonylurea are relatively slightly younger, but the differences really between one and the other is 1 or 2 years, not a large difference. Duration of diabetes, as you can see, 79% of the low risk group were below 10 years, which reflects on a mean duration of diabetes of 6.14 years. The others were between 7.3 to 8.3. So slightly older in duration by 1 to 2 years, and obviously that would reflect on other parameters such as complications. Glycemic control, it was higher or better with in the low risk group of 7.5%, which reflects the younger age and the shorter duration, and perhaps obviously as people naturally in guidelines start with metformin plus or other drugs, and they think of sulfonylurea when they tend to try to intensify treatment. So no wonder that the HbA1c was a bit better in the low risk group compared to the sulfonylurea arms. But importantly, among the sulfonylurea arm, it was almost 8.5 in the glimepiride group. No major differences, though, practically speaking, between 7.4, although obviously there is 1% difference between the glimepiride and the low risk group, which clinically is also meaningful. Come to the results of the study. Does it make a difference between being on sulfonylurea or not being on sulfonylurea when it comes to rates of fasting? And the answer is, as you can see it here, 92% in the low risk group fasted versus 90, 93, 90.5, so hardly any clear difference. Once they fast, if we look into number of days fasted, the highest number of days fasted was in those on the gliclazide MR, but again, the difference is less than a day. Those who completed the month fasted 77% in the gliclazide MR, 72.5% in the low risk group, not including sulfonylurea. The lowest was in the glimepiride, nearly 60%, and the gliclazide molecule was nearly 65%. The average broken days also reflects here, the lowest being on the gliclazide MR, the highest being on the gliclazide short acting, and gliclazide MR was a bit better than the low risk group. I'd like to remind you, this is not a randomized control trial. There is many covariates here that would interfere with these results. Now, when we look into monitoring, we advocate monitoring for anyone during the month of Ramadan, let alone being on sulfonylurea. And as you can see in the circle here, roughly about 30%, give and take, whether they're on sulfonylurea or not, are not doing any SMBG. And if you do indeed look into how frequent do they test, the vast majority are testing as per Ramadan. So Ramadan did not increase, or fasting did not increase the frequency of SMBG, which obviously is contrary to the recommendations and indicate the need for better education. Now, when we look into complications, that reflects the shorter duration and the younger age, and slightly higher percentage of no complications in the yellow, which is the low risk group, and lower rates of hypertension and hyperlipidemia and other complications among them. Come to hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia, which here was observational, not confirmed, in the low risk group was 7.9%, in the gliclazide MR was 10.3, glimepiride 12.7, and in the gliclazide was 15.7. So gliclazide was relatively the highest, and that was statistically significant. There was no statistical significance between gliclazide MR and the low risk group, and indeed also no, yes, that was the one. So gliclazide MR was statistically equal to the low risk group. Frequent hypoglycemia more than 8 days per month, which means more than twice weekly. Again, between the gliclazide MR and the low risk group was identical. Interestingly, the glimepiride here shown more frequent hypoglycemia among the users. Hypoglycemia that required admission to hospital was almost identical between all the four different groups, pretty low among all of them, and no statistical significant. What about hyperglycemia? Well, hyperglycemia is a problem in many of our countries, and the HbA1c reflects, the baseline reflects this. Here, hyperglycemia was between 9.5 in the lowest, which is the low risk group, and the highest was 13 of gliclazide, but statistically there was no difference in any. When you look into the frequent hyperglycemia more than 7 days a month, which means more than twice weekly, yes, that was statistically significant among the group. Was interestingly here in gliclazide, it was the lowest level, and followed by the low risk, and gliclazide, MR, and glimepiride had higher rates of hyperglycemia. Again, there is many covariants here, and we're not sure why of this. Admission to hospital with hyperglycemia was pretty low, 2.4 in the gliclazide MR, 0% in the glimepiride, 4.1% in the low risk group, and 5% in the gliclazide short acting. Was statistically significant between glimepiride and the low risk group, as there was no incidence, but this was very much related to the lower incidence of the problem itself. So in conclusion, dear friends, in the DAR Global Survey, second generation sulfonylurea were comparable to the lower risk group of medication, which includes any of the combination of metformin with DP4 or SGL2 or TZDs or acarbose in any monotherapy, dual therapy, triple, or whatever. The similarities were in the intention to fast, in the duration of fast, in the episodes of hypoglycemia and episodes of hyperglycemia. I did show you in the data some statistical significance between one and the other. However, overall, the gut feeling is that sulfonylurea second generation was not too far, especially the gliclazide MR and the glimepiride. Gliclazide MR seemed to be more favorable when it came to hypoglycemic episodes, and glimepiride was a bit more favorable for the hyperglycemia that led to hospitalization. So give me confidence about this. Thank you, and I look forward to your panel discussion.